Welcome to this session of the Radical History School. It's my great pleasure tonight to welcome Francis O'Grady, the General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, Andrew Adonis, politician and author of the book Ernest Bevin, Labour's Churchill, and Nigel Costley, who's joining us because Francis is having problems with her internet. And Nigel's been invited to join the panel just in case something goes horrifically wrong. Let's hope it does. Just about 2 minutes ago, I
don't want to ask some awkward questions.
What we'll do is as per normal in these sessions, we'll take questions at the end. So if you do have a question about the reappraisal of Ernest Bevin and his life and politics, then if you put your question into the question and answer box, we'll take those questions at the end. And now it's my great pleasure to turn this session of the Radical History School over to Francis O'Grady. Over to you, Francis.
Or perhaps over to Andrew, who I think is going to start with some of the flavour of Ernest's history and story.
Well, thanks, Francis. This is the book, and it is Ernie surrounded by workers in the middle of the Second World War. And well, Francis and I, this is our second time around the lap, as it were. We did a Great Lives, which is, those of you who are really interested in Ernie, it'd be worth looking up. It's the Matthew Paris Great Lives series on Radio 4, and you can get a podcast. And that might be useful if you want to get more Ernie after this. But Ernie's career falls into three different blocks, and all of them are extraordinary. There's this amazing life story. Single mum, dies at the age of 7, almost no education, leaves school at 11, farm labourer, farm boy, really basically paid almost nothing, has a great argument with the farmer he works for, and literally walks out of the farm and arrives in Bristol with nothing other than the addresses of his two older brothers, one of whom's a butcher, works in a butcher's, the other works in a restaurant, and he does odd jobs and eventually becomes gets his own horse and cart and delivers mineral water around Bristol, and then becomes involved in the 1910 Bristol dock strike, one of those great waves of strikes before the First World War, and turns out to be a brilliant organizer, and from that becomes an organizer in the Dockers Union. And then after the war, having visited America during the war as a TUC delegate, because this is just after the sinking of Lusitania, and no one wanted to go as the fraternal delegates. They thought they might not come back to the American Federation of Labour conference in San Francisco. And this completely, this farm boy from Winsford in Dorset, he suddenly meets Sam Gompers, the biggest trade union organisation in the world, goes and to the unveiling of their 7-story high new headquarters on Massachusetts Avenue, just down the road from the White House, which is what gives him the idea for Transport House. Transport House essentially is the American Federation of Labour headquarters in the middle of Washington, which he builds 10 years later, travels across the whole of the United States, this massive wow factor to San Francisco for this union. And he comes back with this idea that what the Dockers Union needs to become is a great union like the American Federation of Labour. And that's what gives him the idea, which leads to the amalgamation of these 14 unions, which is a sort of hugely radical step, because it hadn't been done before, to create a single union, not just a federation, which of course the miners have done before, but to create this big new general union, which then systematically signs up all of the road haulage sectors and many other sectors in the 20s and 30s, navigating the general strike with some difficulty, because Bevin hadn't been in favour of the general strike actually, but equally he does his best to hold the line with it. And in the 30s, this becomes the biggest trade union in the free world. And Ernie Bevin, a kind of Sam Gompers type figure, very authoritarian in many ways, but also hugely charismatic and with a very big political position that he's carved out by the 30s, particularly after Clement Attlee becomes Labour leader in 1935, and the two of them essentially do a kind of double act, leading the Labour movement. So that's phase one of his career. Phase two of his career is made possible by the next big chance event, which of course is war in 1940, and Churchill's decision to form a coalition government with Attlee and the Labour Party, which is sort of reciprocal because it's Attlee who largely puts him in office in 1942. And Churchill understands that that it's essential not to repeat the mistake of the First World War, which is of really serious labour difficulties and not having a close relationship with the labour movement. So Churchill forms a very close partnership with Bevin and vice versa. And whilst Churchill's doing the grand strategy, military strategy for the war, Ernie Bevin is essentially organising the home front. And Ernie is by far the second most important figure in the war, who travels up and down the country, manages the home front, does production agreements sector by sector, persuades women that there should be female conscription, which happens in 1941. The Bevin boys, another facet of this extraordinary ability that Ernie has to cut through the big problems that would otherwise have been with the unions in terms of mobilising the home front. But the deal is that there will be a fundamentally better deal for working people. That's what happens in the war. Compulsory conciliation in return for not having strikes, a commitment to the Beveridge Report, which is going to be implemented afterwards, the 1944 White Paper on employment, which commits for the first time a government to a high and stable level of employment, state generated. This is Keynesianism after the war. All of that essentially is Bevin's contribution, putting Labour and the Labour movement on a par with these Tory elites and Churchill, which have been running the war. And then the third element of his career, which is again unexpected, is he becomes Foreign Secretary in 1945. He wanted to become Chancellor, so he wanted to do the Keynesian thing in 1945. But in this hugely fraught international situation, in particular, Attlee's belief, as he puts it, that he needs a tank, not a sniper, to stand up to Stalin, Ernie becomes Foreign Secretary in 1945, and that's what leads to the creation of the Transatlantic Alliance, which is very much Ernie's idea, NATO, the Federal Republic of Germany, which again is largely Bevin's creation, and a modern state, which becomes a model for Western Europe, with the trade unions at the heart of it. So it's an extraordinary career, and it's a combination of enormous drive by Ernie Bevin personally, all built on his success in creating the Transport and General Workers Union in 1922 and turning it into a pillar of the state, which is what essentially he does during the 20s and 30s, but also a set of chance events. I mean, nobody could have foreseen what was going to happen in the First and the Second World War. And Ernie is extraordinarily adaptable in response to these events. And in the sense, I then hand on to Francis now for our double act, which is what would Ernie Bevin be doing now? You know, taking this great organising capacity and the great opportunity that creates. What would he be doing now in the situation that we now face is, I think, a really interesting question. Somebody with Ernie's commitment to organised labour, organisational capacity, huge belief in the trade union movement. What would he be doing now in the situation that we face? And also, which might be more one for Nigel, perhaps, what would he be doing now in terms of the Labour Party situation that we face too? Who would be his Clem Attlee? I've got a feeling that Keir Starmer might be the Clem Attlee figure, because they're remarkably similar in terms of their sort of political appeal, background and so on. And Ernie was both a great leader, but he was also a great facilitator. He was remarkably loyal to the people he worked with. He was 100% loyal to Churchill all the way through the war, even though they'd had a lot of previous in the general strike in the 20s and 30s. And he was also very, very loyal to Clem Attlee, even though they had very different backgrounds. Clem Attlee, the middle class lawyer background, Ernie, of course, the unskilled worker who had no education background, but they worked incredibly closely for 15 years. So what would he have done as a trade union leader is a big issue. And who would he have been forming big and very close alliances with to make other things possible is another big question, I think, about Ernie and how an Ernie Bevin figure in 2020 might be exploiting the situation that we're currently in with COVID, the new Labour leader, a weak trade union movement in terms of where we were 30 years ago, but full of possibilities when you look at the gig economy, the ununionised care sector, and the fact that, of course, in COVID and this great crisis, in a sense, in a wholly new way, the state, the government, needs the union movement. And no one has played that better than Francis over recent months with that famous photo of her outside number 11 with, the deal that she did, which was an extraordinary deal in many ways, a commitment to working people from a Tory government of a wholly new kind that we wouldn't have expected perhaps even a few months ago.
Always provocative, Andrew. Always provocative. I before we get on to the future, which I would really like to do, what are the lessons from Ernest Bevin for can we learn anything? I do just want to acknowledge something, which is firstly that, as Andrew knows, there's part of me, Ernest Bevin, but Ernie was stood at a bar in a pub. How would I fit? What kind of conversation was on equal pay for women, which Ernest did not champion. On the other hand, he did champion childcare during wartime, and the achievements actually are quite extraordinary, particularly in terms of creating the architecture on which we still rely. I mean, even in the 30s, I think that act for paid holidays was owed a big debt to Ernest Bevin. But through the war, post-war nationalisation of the mines, health and safety standards, massive changes to working people's lives. And I'm kind of conscious of Bevin's own personal experience of poverty, of his single mother, of losing his mother, of his fight with the farmer, a lot of it. And the fact that he even, he had to read the newspaper to many, many members of his family. We forget this kind of stuff and shouldn't, with Union Learn at risk currently. That issue of literacy and the empowerment that comes with being able to read and write, and our sense of responsibility, members of his family, but also community in terms of lifting people and the power of education. A university of life education as opposed to a formal one. So he, to come out of that and to make his own way in the world, to get involved in, he was obviously a Baptist lay preacher, wasn't he, Andrew, which is perhaps where he learned some of his rhetorical skills, a socialist and trade union leader. And then to create, I think, the organisational genius involved in the creation of the Transport and General Workers Union, the bones of which still exist today, that balancing of the regions against the trade groups, only everybody electing the General Secretary. I mean, it was one hell of an achievement to grow that union into such a mighty force. So I think he is what all also fascinates me is why we as a trade union movement lost sight of him today. We would know more about Natalie.
Francis, I'm going to stop you there for a minute. We keep losing sound. Can I just bring Nigel in while we try to resolve that issue? Would that be all right?
Then we would about somebody who very definitely, I think, was somebody who learned the hard way his socialism. Oh.
Nigel, can I ask you to come in here?
Yes, I think Francis is doing her best with very poor Wi-Fi tonight, but I think she made the point, and perhaps Andrew would answer it. I obviously was fascinated by his West Country roots and his experience in Bristol, where particularly the imaginative way he represented the unemployed at the time by leading a silent protest into the cathedral that then led him to negotiate effectively with the Corporation of Bristol to provide a whole series of public works. and it was that it was his imagination, that success that led the dockers to headhunt him in a way that one question I think we should pose ourselves is, would that be possible today, to jump from being basically a community activist into being a full-time official of a union, and then rising up through the ranks? Perhaps Andrew, you've got enough between me and Francis.
Well, Francis raises a wholly new angle, which is very important to understanding, Ernie, which is the nonconformist lay preacher. His mum, who is very close to this, she dies at 7, is a Methodist. I mean, a very active Methodist. This is a very late 19th century thing. You know, this is when village communities were divided between the Tory establishment, the squire, the vicar, and so on, and the Methodists were, as it were, the Democrats and the mass. And his mum was busy raising money for a new Methodist church in the village. And when she dies, the Tory squire tries to refuse to allow her to be buried in the churchyard. I mean, this is the kind of society that you're growing up in. And Ernie not only is sent off to the Methodist Sunday school at the age of 3, but when he arrives in Bristol as a 13-year-old, he gets very involved in one of the big revivalist Methodist churches with a big pacifist socialist preacher, which wasn't uncommon then, the Reverend Moffat Logan, who had a great voice and all of that, and he learns to preach. And Ernie, just as for Churchill, in many ways, the army is his university of life. For Ernie, the chapel is his university of life. And it's very clear to me it's that gives him his self-confidence. It gives him a lot of what becomes his radicalism. He doesn't really think of it as socialism so much at that stage, but a real passion for the dispossessed, as you say, the unemployed. He's getting campaigns going on behalf of the unemployed. He leads this silent demo into Bristol Cathedral, but does all kinds of other things. And as you say, that leads to him being headhunted as an organizer for the Bristol dock strike. It also has a very important after effect too, which is quite poignant. That after the Bristol dock strike of 1910, a lot of the local employers in Bristol, who are liberals, tried to lead a boycott move against him for his mineral water, which is delivering on his horse and cart. And he very, very nearly leaves the country as a result. Very nearly. He thinks of becoming a missionary, and the Methodists would have sent him abroad to become it. It's not completely clear to me, because the records aren't there, what tips the balance between him staying. But I think it may be that by then he's in quite a close relationship with Flo, who he marries. And I think that may be what keeps him. But there's an extraordinary echo here of Andrew Fisher. This is not the Andrew Fisher you maybe think of today, but the Andrew Fisher who was a leader of the miners' strike with Keir Hardie in the 1880s in Ayrshire, who after that strike is blacklisted. And it's the blacklisting that leads Andrew Fisher to emigrate to Australia when he becomes one of the early organisers and leaders of the Australian Labour Party, and is the first Labour Prime Minister of Australia who gets a majority. And it's a very interesting parallel. Instead of emigrating, which he comes quite close to doing only in 1910-11, instead of that, what Ernest Bevin essentially does is to form his own union. And though he doesn't become Prime Minister, he becomes as close as damn it to becoming Prime Minister at his right hand in the 1940s. And this, when people talk about the rise of the trade unions and it being relentless and so on, and it owing more to Methodism than to Marxism, as if somehow this made it more establishment, that's not the case. The Methodists and the nonconformist elites, including those that came up through the trade union movement, were a massive insurgent threat to the established order in Britain before and after the First World War. And Bevin is anything but a kind of cuddly and acceptable face of Labourism for the elite. On the contrary, he's a big insurgent threat to them, a leader of the general strike. And it's only by the 1930s and 40s that this all seems more acceptable. And all of that story is in the book. And it's a very dramatic story too. And it's a story through the First World War, the general strike, the bitter trade union politics of the 1930s in deciding whether or not they're going to be pacifist or stand up to the dictators. And it's only in retrospect that it seems like an inevitability in the rise the labour movement. At the time, it was being fought every inch of the way.
Could you mention what he did on behalf of the horses when he first got the job? I think that's a sign of his character.
Yeah, he does a deal with when he first becomes the carters branch chair of the Dockers Union, which is bringing in the drivers, the carters, into the Dockers Union in before the First World War. He does a deal with the employers that instead of being paid piece rates, which they're being paid before, which meant that the horses were literally being weighed down, overloaded, and dying under the strain. He does a deal for maximum weights on the horses, which means there isn't an incentive on the drivers to overload the horses, and the horses live longer as a result. So he's a kind of early champion of PCA, as well as getting a minimum wage for the dockers, which is one of his great and early achievements during the First World War. He was a great humanitarian, Ernie Bevin, and that is extended to his the rights of horses as well as the rights of dockers.
All God's creatures.
We go back to Francis. Yeah. Francis, do you want to take up your point?
Well, one of the points that kind of intrigues me is why Ernest Bevin was lost from history, and and I think Andrew deserves credit for his book, and it's very accessible as well as a book. It is a great story, great material in terms of his life, but it's also very well written. But why, certainly on the left, we quite rightly admire and know an awful lot about Clem Attlee, and yet this man who was Clem Attlee's right-hand man, who literally sat across the table at cabinet so that they could have that eye contact, and the bruiser who would come in to defend Clem against all the various plots and conspiracies that go on in the world of politics, and encourage a sense of discipline and clarity, not least in his anti-fascism. Why it is that he was sort of lost from, where are the, your book is great, but where are all the other books? Where is the film? Where's the discussion on the left about whether we agree with everything about him or not? He was clearly a giant of a man and an incredibly important figure for the whole Labour movement.
Clem Attlee thought that that the most brilliant person he'd ever worked with was Ernie Bevin. And there was this very, very close bond. As Francis says, there were repeated attempts to get Attlee out. Herbert Morrison always thought he'd be a better leader, but Cripps went through phases of thinking he would be too. I counted when I was writing the book 7 serious plots to get him out, 1 or 2 which could easily have resulted in Ernie becoming Labour Party leader himself. Particularly during 1947-48, when you have a really serious economic crisis, devaluation, the coldest winter in record, so quite a lot of public unpopularity as well as a lot of Labour scheming. But Ernie never wants the top job. His view is, and it's quite an interesting view, his view is that not only is Clem better at it, Clem can do Parliament and things like that, which Ernie hasn't got much time for, but he sees the Labour Party as a coalition. It is a coalition between the trade unions and the big union leaders like him and the middle-class parliamentarians like Clem, and the two need to come together, which is a very great insight into what made Labour so successful in the 1940s. It's the party of the middle class and the working class, the unions and the professions coming together in a really serious way. And having decided that, the thing about Ernie is that he doesn't shift. So all these plots come along, and what Ernie does is tells them all to get lost. The famous line when somebody says that Herbert Morrison is his own worst enemy, and Clem says, "Not what I'm about." I mean, he literally saw all these people off. And looking at the success of that government, and I was a member of the Blair-Brown government, one of my reflections on it is that part of the reason that 1945 government was so successful is that Attlee and Bevin stood together like a rock. There was total loyalty between them. And crucial to this is that Bevin never wanted Attlee's job. And actually, the tragedy of it, because all human relationships end in tragedy, because as somebody put it recently, the problem is that lives end. The tragedy of it is that Bevin dies in 1951. If he'd been in better health and lived longer, then I think it's quite possible Labour would have won that third election, the 1951 election. And Britain could have become like Sweden and Scandinavia, with Labour as regarded as the natural and dominant party of government. But alas, what happens is Ernie becomes very ill from 1949. He dies in office, essentially. I mean, the poignant bit, which I recount in the last chapter, is Ernie literally is found by Flo in bed with his red box by his side, with the key grasped vice-like in his hand. He literally dies on the job. Whereas if he'd lived for longer, then I think Attlee's position would have been stronger. I think Labour would have been in a fundamentally stronger position in the 1951 election. And this great partnership which they forged, which sees Labour through the coalition with Churchill in the early 1940s and proves such a successful government after 1945, it could have carried on for 10 years, not just the 6 years that happens. And if it had carried on for 10 years and won 3 elections, then I think, and this is the great what if, then Labour Britain, the Attlee-Bevin Britain after 1945, with the radicalism that Bevan brings too in the NHS, this could have turned Britain into a kind of Sweden with Labour and the trade unions as the established order for the post-war era, which alas doesn't happen. Instead, unfortunately, the Tories come back in 1951 and they become the dominant party.
I mean, the other big what if, Andrew, is if he had seen the UK as at the heart of Europe, maybe, because all of that work that he went into getting money apart from anything else, but also the rebuilding of Europe, the rebuilding of Germany on principles like co-determination. And yet he looked across the pond, didn't he, really, for his kind of key relationship.
I think that's fair comment. What Bevin's great achievement was creating the Democratic Federal Republic of Germany. He understood the importance of well-functioning democracies. He understood that in Britain, he understood that and saw it in the United States, and he sought to create it in Germany. And he had no truck with the people who wanted a repeat of Versailles, punitive reparations, which of course a lot in France wanted, vis-a-vis Germany too. And the success of the Federal Republic of Germany, which has arguably been Europe's most successful state since 1945, a lot of that is down to Ernie. What he didn't grasp, but then to be fair, not many people in Britain grasped in the 1940s, is that these new reviving states of Germany and France after 1945, that when they sought to create this federal type organization between them, the European Coal and Steel Community, which becomes the European Union, that's something we should have been a party to. My own view on that is that was an understandable mistake in 1950-51, because this looked very futuristic, the European Union then. It was a huge mistake by the late 1950s, when you had the Treaty of Rome, the Common Market, and these were established facts. Now, Bevin was a great one for facts, and I reckon if he'd been Foreign Minister or Labour leader in the late 50s, he would absolutely have wanted to be in this European Union. But when it was just an idea, quite a hypothetical idea in 1950 to 51, I think it was much more understandable what he was doing. But just to bring it back to the unions, I see one of the questions in the chat is what was Ernie's view of the relationship between unions and the TUC? And the other great partnership which Ernie forged was his great partnership with Walter Citrine and the person doing Francis's job. And though they weren't bosom pals, I mean, there was a bit of tension between them. Bevin and Citrine forged a 20-year partnership, and a perfectly good one, all the way through from the general strike of 1926 through to Citrine leaving the TUC to become whatever he becomes. I think he becomes chairman of the Electricity Council, doesn't he, in 1946. And it was on a shared understanding that that the trade unions, that the individual unions did need to be more than the sum of the parts, and that what was needed was both strong unions but also a strong TUC. It's Ernie who, with Citrine, sets up the economic division and economic committee of the TUC, which becomes in many ways its most important agent in the 1930s and 40s. And though there was a bit of rivalry because they were both quite strong leaders, they did both understand that what was needed was strong and effective union leaders on the General Council, but also a strong and effective General Secretary with an effective transport house, as it then was, and what becomes the TUC headquarters, which Ernie plays quite a big part with Citrine in strengthening. I think the figure that sticks in my mind is that in the mid-1920s, there are only about 10 or 11 permanent staff of the TUC. By the late 1930s, that's risen to 50 or 60. That is the joint work of Ernie and Walter Citrine. But Francis might have more of a view of the TUC and how it develops in this period when Ernest Bevin is leading the T&G.
I think what strikes me is that alignment of the party and the trade union movement, and Bevin as a bridge between the two in terms of a clear-eyed sense of project. And as you say, Andrew, it wasn't that there was always agreement, but there was real ambition, it seems to me, for working people in a changed society. Real ambition for economic and social justice, but the kind of justice that makes a real difference to people's lives. And the TUC, which, as you quite rightly say, Bevin supported Citrine in building the resources of the TUC to become the architect of many of the bills and the new acts and new rights that we then saw flow through that Attlee government. So that's what impresses me most, is some, if you like, what I see as traditional trade union values of loyalty, solidarity, but also that kind of, we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to make a difference. We're not just going to protest, we're going to deliver something big for working people.
And also, just to add, because those of us of a certain age, of course, remember Transport House, but there may be some younger people here who don't. The relationship between them was symbolised by this amazing 7-storey building in Smith Square, literally round the corner from Parliament, which Ernie builds. Literally, this is one of his big projects of the late 1920s when the T&G is forged. And he has, I think, sort of 3 floors to the T&G. The TUC has a floor, and the Labour Party has a few floors. All 3 of these institutions literally share the same building. And Ernie has a big office. Whoever's the Labour Party General Secretary, there's different people during this period have a big office, and Citrine has a big office, and they're literally all the time running the labour movement essentially between them, and this becomes for 50 years. Transport House is synonymous with the labour movement. People talk about Transport House when they're talking about the unions and the TUC, and they also talk about Transport House when they're talking about the Labour Party. All the way through the 50s, 60s and 70s, Transport House is the signature phrase for the Labour Party. And so influential is this model that when the Tories think they need to raise their game after 1945 and develop a much stronger central organisation, they buy the next door building in Smith Square. I mean, literally, imitation being the highest form of flattery. The Tories buy the next door building and put their headquarters right next door to it. And what is so symbolic is not until Labour move out, which I think is a mistake actually, for reasons I'm not completely clear about, the T&G, when it becomes Unite, they move out of Smith Square and sell Transport House, which I think it looks to me like a big mistake actually. They probably should have stayed there. And when they sell it, that also leads to the Labour Party moving out and going to Walworth Road. And Francis can tell me where the Unite moves to, isn't it Holborn?
Yes, yeah. I mean, this was actually when Bill Morris was General Secretary. I had the privilege of working in Transport House for the T&G. when it was in Smith Square.
Can you tell us the story about how it stops being in Smith Square and moves out? Because I think it's quite a symbolic story. About
now, I would have to confess I was somebody who wouldn't have liked to have seen the TNG leave Transport House, but I think at the time Bill had a real modernising impulse. He thought that the union should be positioned in a modern building, and you know, almost as a symbol of moving on into new times, new ways to organise and so on. But it was quite a divisive issue. Like I say, I left just before the building was sold, so I didn't experience it in the way that others did. But I still have incredibly fond memories of that building. You know, when you had the Dockers Hall and you'd have huge meetings. I was there when Ron Todd was General Secretary, and it was, you know, it felt like a hub with all that history, but, you know, incredibly lively too. So incredible officers. So, yeah. But maybe we should move on to the future a bit, or I don't know. We've got
one question. Sorry to jump in, Francis. One question I'd like is about his character in terms of his relations with power. He was never overly flattered or suckered in or belittled by mixing with power. Even though his sort of humble origins, he was able to move, and he wasn't. I mean, from the time he represented the Dockers and became known as the Dockers KC, he was able to perform in court in a way that really took apart the other side and won on behalf of the Dockers. The way he moved into Parliament, they found him a seat, didn't they? And he had to. He didn't know any of the procedures of Parliament, yet he suddenly was not just an MP, but a minister, and also across the world. There was a story, I'm not sure it's in your book, but about him bumping it or in some grand dinner in Paris, and the British ambassador talking about Bristol and oh, I used to live in this grand house in Clifton, and Bevin said, oh yes, I remember that. I used to deliver water to your door. Yeah, I mean, there aren't too many people like that who don't get somehow corrupted by the trappings of power, but he doesn't seem to have been one of them.
No, I see no sign whatever that he was ever corrupted by power, and the evidence of his will and all that, he doesn't leave that much money. Flo actually is in quite hard times after his death, and very, very different from, for example, Ramsay MacDonald. You know, Ramsay MacDonald famously says when he pulls the plug on the 1931 Labour government and, you know, in that infamous act and forms the government with the Tories, so tomorrow every duchess in London will want to kiss me, he says. And he's forming a love affair. I mean, literally, this is literally the aristocratic embrace with the Marchioness of Londonderry. None of that ever happens to Ernie at all, ever. He and Flo remain very close. They were fellow members of the Bristol Socialist Society, which is how they met in before the First World War. And though he knows how to deal with the rich and famous, he never sells out. And that's one of his great features, is that he always deals with these people on equal terms. There's another side to it too, which is that Ernie is never overly flattered by the powerful anyway. When he meets the great dictators, they never have that much impact on him. Whereas Churchill is overly influenced actually by meeting them. Churchill falls for Mussolini in the 1920s, talks about the kind and gentle Signor Mussolini after he's met him in Rome. That never happens to Ernie. And equally, Churchill falls dangerously under the spell of Stalin in 1945 too, and thinks he can do deals with Stalin over the future of Germany and so on in 45, whereas Ernie can see Stalin for what he is in 45 as a dangerously unbalanced megalomaniac, and stands up to him very seriously, which is very important to the Berlin blockade, to forming the Federal Republic of Germany, and not allowing, as Churchill might have done, Stalin to have an equal say over the management of West Germany. So he was very much his own man all the way through. He dealt with people on his own terms, people who he respected because he believed he could do business with them to get big things done. And that was true of his relationship with Attlee and his relationship with Churchill. He never fell under the spell of the rich, the famous and the powerful because they were rich, famous and powerful. And I think for the good of the British Labour Party and Labour movement, they were very lucky to have somebody who had the values, the self-confidence and the lack of impressionability of Ernie Bevin, because if you look at what happened to MacDonald, who had quite a similar background in many ways to Ernie's, and what happened to him in similar circumstances, it wasn't a pretty story.
I mean, you do get the sense of a man who was never going to lose sight of his roots. He remembered his roots. And who couldn't be bought or flattered or seduced by power and money. I think, if anything, one of Ernest's flaws for me potentially was, here was a man who was self-educated primarily, as many in that generation were, but it did leave him with a suspicion of intellectuals. And I think it probably is, to what degree was Ernest Bevin anti-Semitic, that his suspicion of, in particular, Communist Party intellectuals, very often that left coincided with Jewish intellectuals. And I do wonder to what extent that anti-Semitism was informed by that suspicion of intellectualism. So I think, he's a real man. He is flawed, in some cases seriously so, but it's important to understand the complexity of him, I think, as well. So should we?
I was wondering whether we wanted to bring it. I can see there's quite a few questions in the Q&A, aren't there? Nigel, do you want to bring in any of the?
Well, I was just, his sort of controversy in terms of his role as Foreign Secretary, particularly in regard to nuclear power. I think your book, I agree in terms of he sees his role as a trade union negotiator, but perhaps how would you answer that one?
Well, his concern was, this was in the very, very fraught situation after 45, was that if Stalin had nuclear weapons, given the unstable situation in Central and Eastern Europe, and Britain didn't, that Britain might be subject to nuclear blackmail, and he didn't think that Britain could simply hide behind the American deterrent, because at that stage he wasn't convinced that America would stand behind the security of Western Europe. It's only with the Berlin blockade in 1949 that it becomes clear that the United States will stay in Europe, and it's George Marshall who's the crucial figure. Burns, who's the Secretary of State in 1945, it tries to triangulate between Britain and Russia. He tries to negotiate with Stalin directly for a neutral and demilitarized Germany, which Bevin's view is, which is quite controversial on the left, but I think is correct, that a neutral and demilitarized Germany with no Western troops in at all, given that you've got massive Russian troops in the east and in all of the buffer states which have now been colonized by Stalin on Germany's borders, that will become a client state of Stalin and the Soviet Union. And what happens in East Berlin, where essentially the Social Democrats are abolished and forced to fuse with the communists, is what he believes will happen across the whole of West Germany too, if a neutral and demilitarized Germany is the result of peace negotiations after 45. So it's a very, very fraught situation then. And that's what leads to Ernie Bevin's famous statement, "I want this bloody thing over here and I want a Union Jack on top of it," as he believes that unless there is this nuclear deterrent, then Britain will be blackmailed by Stalin and have to agree to a neutral and demilitarized Germany at that stage. And the United States, under Jimmy Burns, the then Secretary of State, won't stand by them. On the contrary, the United States policy in 1945 is that all American troops will be withdrawn within 2 years, which is Truman's policy through until the formation of NATO and the Berlin blockade of 1948-49. So we all have different views on nuclear weapons and the deterrent, and whether it was a good idea or a bad idea. But that was the situation which led Ernie to believe that Britain needed to have the deterrent. Would he have taken the view 20 years later, 10 years later, when you have NATO and you have an American deterrent, which is firmly committed to what becomes the West? That concept of the West isn't really applicable until you get the formation of NATO in 48-49. You can never tell, you can never transplant somebody's attitude in one context to another context. So I can't be sure about that. But that was the specific context in which he committed to the nuclear deterrent. And actually, the Labour Party then, most of the cabinet agreed with that then. There was an element of the left with Michael Foot, which was against. It doesn't include most of the Labour ministers. Bevin is strongly behind the creation of NATO and the deterrent in the late 40s. And when the Bevinites, as they are, resigned from the government in 51, it's on NHS charges. It's not on the Korean War and the principle of the nuclear deterrent. That all comes later in the mid-1950s.
Okay, Andrew, we're running out of time. I'm quite aware of that. So we're going to take some of the questions and answers. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely, yeah.
So the first one is, how do we promote social mobility and unleash working class talent? Do you have any...
Well, I think what I'm really struck by, looking in the middle part of the 20th century, and in some cases into the later part, is the trade unions as organizations were amazing institutions for social mobility. It is the institution of the Transport and General Workers Union that turns this farm boy from West Somerset into Foreign Secretary and essentially Deputy Prime Minister in the 1940s. And I think an interesting question is whether the unions could do more on that score now, to be agents of social mobility now. I mean, Francis might have
well, it would help. Yeah, I mean, we're currently facing a government pulling the plug on our learning and education arm called Union Learn, which, you know, anywhere between 200,000 and 250,000 workers benefit from every year. 2/3 of them haven't got a single qualification. That to me is mobility, to get that first ever qualification, and only doing it because the union's there alongside them, making it work for them. So we've got, anyway, a major fight on our hands on that front. But I think there's also, you know, there's a kind of myth of mobility, isn't there? Because the truth is, all the evidence is out there that the more unequal a society, the less social mobility there is. You know, it's not glass ceilings, it's concrete ceilings. So one of the key ways to give those opportunities, provide those opportunities, is to have a more equal society in the first place. And my goodness me, have we got ideas and thoughts and action to take on that front. And I would say, by the way, Andrew, just for the record, trade unions have been growing over the last 3 years. We don't shout about it because it's modest growth, but we are growing. And, you know, I think for many of us, we know that trade unionism was the key that unlocked doors for us, you know, whether it was shop stewards training. You know, I would never have got up and spoken in a meeting without stage 1 shop stewards training. So it's not just about qualifications, it's about confidence, belief in yourself, a sense of, you know, being able to articulate the values and beliefs that we have. You know, that's what kind of, for me, is as important as getting that promotion at work. Which again, we know in trade unionized workplaces, much more likely to get training, much more likely to get fair progression, much more likely to get not just fair pay, but equal pay. So, you know, trade unionism is still a vehicle for progression, but we have, my goodness me, not just the UK, but around the world, that kind of obscene inequality is holding us all back.
Yeah, thank you, Francis. Thank you, Francis. That's great. Another question from John McCowan. Bevin's achievements are largely unparalleled in the 20th century politics. Which one stands out as his greatest, do you think?
Sorry, I missed that question.
The question was, which one of Bevin's achievements do you think was his greatest?
His greatest achievements?
Yes. Yeah.
I think his greatest achievement was well, I think there are two great achievements. Founding the Transport and General Workers Union, which was the bedrock of what became the labour movement which dominated the mid part of the 20th century, and founding NATO, which ensured that that Labour in office could both create a welfare state and do so in a context of European and global security. And you can't do anything in government unless you've got security sorted. And part of the reason why the welfare state took off in the way it did was that the security situation was stable, which it might not have been if there hadn't been NATO. Just imagine if the Berlin airlift had led to the occupation of West Berlin and further warfare in Europe, which could easily have happened if Stalin had tried to move further west after 1947-48, then that would have vitiated all of the social progress which that Labour government made. So I would put those two big institutions that he created at the beginning of his career as a national figure and the end of his career as a national figure: the Transport and General Workers Union in 1922 and NATO in 1949. They, as it were, bookend his great public national career, and those are two phenomenal institutions which largely shaped Britain in the mid and late part of the 20th century.
I would agree with Andrew on the first, because that was the precondition, I believe, for the party to flourish and have a chance of power, was that, you know, incredible organising genius in terms of the trade union movement. But for me, it's also about that his role in creating a new social contract, it seems to me. It was, you know, the UK's answer to Roosevelt's New Deal, particularly for workers. It's the language we still use today of wanting that New Deal, that new social settlement that did shift power in favour of working people, but also delivered real change to people's lives. And I just think, you know, where I would have some sympathy with Ernest Bevin's attitudes to some of the fur coat brigade, as he would call them, is, you know, that urgency that, yes, I do want to put money in people's pockets. I do want people to have leisure time with their families. I do want health and safety at work. And if the only way to get that, by the way, is bring it into public ownership, because that's the way that we guarantee workers will have a voice and decent standards. You know, that's a settlement that we still look to as an inspiration. In my view, the new settlement we need will, of course, be different to one that was crafted in the last century. But the vision and the inspiration and the scale of ambition, I think, is, you know, still provides inspiration for trade unionists and socialists alike.
That's very good. Thank you very much. There's a question here about how would you think, if Bevin was Foreign Secretary today, what do you think would have been his key priorities, and how might he have played the populist world leaders?
Well, if Ernie had been big in Labour politics and on the foreign policy side, but just big in Labour politics at large in the last 10 years, I don't think Brexit would have happened, because we wouldn't have had this problem of the red wall and the disaffection of the traditional working class. On the contrary, Ernie would have got to the roots of the problem, which was getting a new deal, as using Francis's phrase, a new deal for workers after the 2008 crisis, which in some ways was quite similar to the 1931 crisis. And if that had been sorted out, then I don't think that there would have been the rise of this populism, because a good part of the reason for the rise of the right populism, there isn't a dominant working class trade union figure like Ernie who can take it on directly. So I think that this great catastrophe of Brexit and all that's gone with it in terms of right-wing populism in the last 10 years, I think there's a good chance if Ernie had been leading a big union and had been active in Labour politics in the last 10 years, that wouldn't have happened.
Okay, thank you.
I would love to have seen, I'd love to see Ernest Bevin in a room wiping the floor with Donald Trump and Putin.
Absolutely, and Nigel Farage.
Yeah, throw him into the mix, why not?
So there's another question here then about if Bevin was Foreign Secretary today, what do you think he would have made of the Israeli-Palestine situation?
That unfortunately plays to his weak suit, because as I say in the book, I have quite a long section on it. He was pretty anti-Semitic, Ernie. Britain is the colonial power in Palestine in 1945. And despite the fact that we were committed to the establishment of a Jewish state and what we now call the two-state solution, that comes out of a Royal Commission in the late 30s, Ernie won't proceed with the formation of a Jewish state and instead fights the Ben Gurion, and there's really serious bloodshed with large numbers of British troops sent to fight what becomes a Jewish terrorist organization. But the reason why there is a terrorist organization is because Britain won't move towards the formation of a state. And I think looking back on it, that's a genuine tragedy, because there was a real chance then, if it had been done by Britain and the United States through the United Nations and the mandate, the British mandate as the colonial power in Palestine, that you could have established a genuine two-state settlement in the late 1940s, which doesn't happen. What happens instead is that rather than set up a Jewish state, British forces simply leave. They simply abandon the mandate, which leads to a war. It leads to Ben Gurion literally starting a war to create this Jewish state. And that means that the Jewish state is created by an act of war, which very much characterizes how it comes to relate to its Palestinian and Arab neighbors thereafter. So it couldn't really have been worse handled, the policy on Palestine, Israel, and the Palestinian territories after 1945. And it absolutely wasn't, I'm afraid, Ernie's finest hour.
Okay, we're coming very, very close to the end of this now. Francis, do you want to respond to that, or?
I was going to ask Andrew to what extent. I kind of have this sense of, this new world opening, whereas Ernest Bevin as Foreign Secretary was still wedded to a faith in imperialism. And I wonder whether you would agree that he was an imperialist.
Yes, I would, is the answer. He was very Churchillian in that sense. He wanted a kind of New Deal in the empire, but he didn't want Britain to cease being the colonial power. He was, whereas it was Clem Attlee who took this big, bold decision to give unilaterally independence to India. I don't think Ernie would have taken that decision, but Clem doesn't follow through when it comes to Egypt, the Middle East, the parts of the Far East where Britain is the colonial power too. What Ernie tries to do is to reconstitute the empire, and I think Africa, there's no move towards independence in any of the African territories either, and I think that was a mistake.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We've unfortunately come to the end of our time, as is the way with all of these sessions. Thank you for your time, Andrew. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Francis, for a very entertaining evening. I'm sorry we had problems with your line. I hope we can meet again.
It's my fault. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Nigel, too, for stepping into the breach. I really appreciate that. The next Radical History session will be on December the 9th, a Wednesday, not a Tuesday, when we have 3 librarians from the Marx Memorial Library, the Workers' Library in Manchester, and the TUC Library coming on to talk about the work that they do. And that will be on Wednesday, December the 9th. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.